Our new unit is South Africa, and South Africa is a fascinating country. There's a lot going on in South Africa. Um, just a picture to kind of whet your appetite about what South Africa looks like. Pretty cool place. This is Cape Town in the southern tip of South Africa, said to be one of the most beautiful capes in the world. Some basic facts about South Africa, some of it on the obvious side. It's located on the southern tip of Africa. It's a land rich in natural resources, which includes gold and diamonds. The first Europeans to settle in South Africa came in 1652. There had been many other African or Europeans who had come through South Africa over the years, but the first settlers were the Dutch. The Dutch farmers, they were known as Boers, and they spoke a language called Afrikaans. They're also known as Afrikaners. The Bantu are black farmers from the north who come into South Africa looking for more fertile soil. South Africa is a diverse society. We call it a multiracial society, which means that it's a country with many different ethnicities. You have blacks making up roughly 80% of the population, whites of European descent, about 9%, so-called coloreds, which are mixed European and African combined, about roughly 9 or 10%, and Asians, mostly Indians, people from India, about 2.5%. Now, as we say, the Dutch were the first Europeans to come to South Africa. They call themselves Afrikaners. The British, as a result of the Napoleonic Wars, win possession of South Africa, and they come and take over Cape Colony in 1806. That forces the Boers, the Dutch-derived Boers, to leave Cape Colony and head north in what's called the Great Trek, and they found Orange Free State and Transvaal. Importantly, diamonds are discovered in Transvaal in 1867, and guess what? The British annex, that is to say, take over Transvaal, and then they actually find gold as well in the Transvaal region. So it shows that South Africa is a country rich in natural resources. There's a war that's fought between the Boers and the British, a 3-year war called the Boer War or Boer Wars, and the Brits win the war. So into the 20th century, in 1910, South Africa becomes a nation. It's still part of the British Empire formally, and it will be so until 1960. But the government, even though it's only about 9% of the population, the white Afrikaners run the government, and non-whites are not permitted to have any vote or really any say in the government. Just a couple years after, in 1912, the African National Congress, ANC, is founded, seeking to promote black unity and rights and black freedoms. But then the story really gets to be more important for us, and that is that the Afrikaner National Party, the National Party, as we say, wins control of South Africa and runs the government. And they promote purely white interests. They institute the system known as apartheid. Sometimes people call it apartheid, but in South Africa they call it apartheid. And so what is apartheid? Well, take a look at this chart. So in this chart, you see that the black population in the center column there makes up, back in the days of apartheid, roughly 19 million people. They own 13% of the land. They have about less than 20% of the national income. There's only one doctor per 44,000 black people in South Africa. These are the native population of South Africa. The infant mortality rate, 60%. And the teacher to pupil ratio is one teacher per 60 students. Now check the white population, about 4.5 million. The land allocation, they own 87% of all land in South Africa. Their national income, 75%. The doctors, one doctor for every 400 people. Infant mortality rate is 2.7%, and the teacher to pupil ratio, one teacher for every 22 students. So does that give you a picture of what apartheid is? It's basically a system that favors clearly the white population in a huge way. Black people are in a subservient state, as will be seen. South Africa was a rigidly divided society. Now, apartheid does not exist any longer. Since 1994, it's been over. But it was once a very rigidly divided society based on racial inequality and injustice. There had been segregation in South Africa for centuries, but apartheid really formalizes that and legalizes it. And from 1948 to 1994, segregation and discrimination laws are the law of the land. Apartheid required that blacks and whites would live separately, use separate public facilities, things like bathrooms, waiting areas, in a bus station or airport, for example, separate schools, separate hospitals, separate doctors, all of it. They'd have only limited contact. They couldn't marry or be in any kind of romantic relationship. And as I said earlier, apartheid is fittingly pronounced apartheid. It sounds like apartheid. It's basically apartness, the distinction of the social classes, or not social classes so much, but ethnic classes are separated legally. The Population Registration Act of 1948 basically classified four groups of people: whites, blacks, coloreds, and Asians. All black people in South Africa during the age of apartheid were required to carry a pass book. It contained the fingerprints, photo, information that was required to be able to travel to non-black areas. And as we will learn more by the end of the week, there was a tremendous amount of resistance against apartheid, and burning the passbooks became a form of protest. This is what a passbook would look like. Passbooks were required by all black people in South Africa. In 1951, they came up with the Bantu Authorities Act. It created 10 black South African Bantustans, more commonly known as homelands. And the homelands are these darker colored regions, mostly in the northeast section of South Africa. They were rural places with little to no development, no electricity, in most places, or indoor plumbing, so that means outhouses. There were 10 homelands set up, mostly by ethnic groupings. It was basically what you would call a divide and conquer strategy. You would divide the people up so they couldn't come together and protest effectively. Divide and conquer. The Bantustans were roughly 13% of all South African land, and it was mostly the most marginal land, the least fertile and the least valuable land that they put the black people onto. People were forced to leave their homes to move into these homelands or Bantustans, and they were crowded and very, very poor, as I'm going to show you with some pictures. So look at these places. Can you imagine living in places such as these? Just thrown together shacks, basically. Bantustans, homelands. So what do most black South Africans do for a living? Well, if you can tell from this picture, the answer is mining. Go back here for a second. Most South African men would do mining. Women would be farmers, or if they were living closer to developed areas, they would be basically doing domestic work, like being house servants. So again, South African apartheid was all about separation. All public spaces, courts, schools, hospitals, bathrooms, and of course, the schools for black people received a lot less money than white schools. Black students were illiterate in large measure because of the inferior education that they got. Much of this is very similar to the American situation in what we call the Jim Crow era of the United States history, back roughly 1890s up to about 1950s. Very, very similar before the Civil Rights Movement. You can see from these signs, boundary between white and all races area. White area, Europeans only, non-Europeans only. Everything was separate. Everything was completely separated, even more extremely so than in the United States. Importantly, black people could not vote. They were kept in low-paying jobs, educated in poor schools, identification cards, as we mentioned, separate facilities, stores, restaurants, hospitals. You start to get the picture. There was an insulting term that was used by South African whites to refer to black South Africans. It was called kafir, and that was basically like our N-word, kafir. Banning was finally a tool of apartheid. If you acted in a way that was contrary to the government, if you spoke against the government, you could be banned. And that would mean that you would be not allowed to be in a room with more than one person at a time, except for your family. So it basically prevented large gatherings. So you would be banned, and it would mean that you would basically not be allowed to interact in society. Pretty extreme and severe punishment. Of course, you could be with your family, but other than family, you're not allowed to be with more than one person at a time. And so a lot of important people were banned. Organizations were banned as well, a way of just basically eliminating their effectiveness. Like the ANC, the African National Congress, was banned at a certain time. Okay, so you get the picture of apartheid. The assignment for today is to do a reading based on the experience of apartheid for people in South Africa, black people in South Africa. And then tomorrow we're going to begin to learn about the efforts to resist apartheid, and they were quite extensive. All right, well, that's it.